So my name is Moira Yip. I'm on the program committee of the Charlotte Hulse Memorial Library in Lovell, Maine. We have a speakers series for 2021 to 22, and this is our second talk in the series. The topic today is about the Francophone heritage here in Maine. And Lise herself will tell you more about exactly what aspects of that she's going to address. But just in case you haven't sort of noticed, we are surrounded by French place names, by French businesses, by neighbors whose last names hark back to somewhere in their heritage coming from France. I'll give you some examples in case you haven't thought about it much. So for towns, we have what we in Maine call Calais, but if you're French, you call it Calais. Then here in town, Sabatis Mountain is often said to be from the French for St. John the Baptist, to be a corruption of that, Saint Jean Baptiste. We have Paris, Maine, just down the road, otherwise known as Paris. And there is, to my amusement, a town somewhere in Maine called Frenchville, which I'm not actually sure where it is, but it's called Frenchville. And for local businesses, we have Aubuchon Hardware, Aubuchon Hardware.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming back. Really appreciate you being here again.
Someone needs muting. Okay, that's gone. We had LaVerdiere for a long time. I looked up Rennie's in Bridgeton because I wasn't sure, and my brief Googling says that it could be indeed French from René, but there's also a Scottish surname Rennie and a Hungarian one, Rennie as well. So who knows? But we will be learning today about this very substantial part of Maine's heritage. Our speaker, we're so delighted that she accepted our invitation. Lise Pelletier was the director of the Acadian Archive Acadienne at the University of Maine at Fort Kent. She was born in Fort Kent, so she's a proper Mainer, and then she was raised across the border in New Brunswick. She's always had both feet firmly planted on both shores of the St. John River. And when she was living in St. Clair, she began working with the local historical society for documents and to preserve her parish's history. And she started collecting oral histories. And since then, she has promoted an awareness of this history on both sides of the border. So she was recently inducted into the Franco-American Hall of Fame, and she's the president of the Maine Acadian Heritage Council. So I'm just delighted she's going to speak to us this evening. She'll speak for around about 45 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for questions. And now we're going to change things up so that she can share her screen with us. So, and I'm going to hand over to Lise. So, Julie, you're in charge.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
We can see you, Lise. Perfect. I'm now going to mute myself too.
Okay. So I'm going to talk specifically about Acadia, but specifically about Acadians of Maine in northern Maine, in the upper St. John Valley in Maine. First, I'd like to explain the names Acadia and Acadian. The name Acadia comes from a Portuguese explorer, Giovanni de Verrazano, who traveled to the New World in 1524. And he visited the Atlantic coast, found that it was lush with vegetation, and there were numerous types of fish and fauna, and he likened the place to the Greek Eden. And so he called it Arcadie. Now, in time, when news reached Europe that this place was teeming with fish, many European countries sent their subjects to fish and, if possible, send these products home to Europe. Well, the French did so as well, and they also started trading partnerships with the natives. These were very friendly relationships, and the First Nations were able to barter furs and fish and wildlife for commodities that were only available in Europe. And after a while, the government of France decided that it was time to establish a permanent trading post. Obviously, the business, if you will, was going very well. And the trading post was to be a precursor to a colony. They had not exactly decided where that would be. Samuel de Champlain, however, or Champlain, had visited the area, and he decided that the place to be would be, let me see here, see if I can switch this, would be on St. Croix Island. So the map you see depicts St. Croix Island. You see that red dot. It is quite small. It is situated now between the province of New Brunswick and the state of Maine, and it is known as the International St. Croix Island. So Samuel de Champlain, along with Pierre Dugas, Jean de Poutrincourt, along with 75 or 76 crew members, went to St. Croix and established a permanent trading post. That is, this is what it looked like. This is the island. You can see that it is very small and completely isolated in the wide river. This is what the habitation or habitation looked like. It was the first prefab to be set up in the New World. Much of the residences and buildings were built in advance in France, and the timber and hardware transported on the ship and then set up on the island. The French arrived early enough to plant a garden, and were looking forward to a nice fall where they would harvest their gardens and make supplies for the winter. However, winter came very, very early. And as you saw, the island is not well protected from winds and cold. And so the gardens failed. And in a very short time, the crew did not have much to eat. Half the population died. So out of 79, 35 died. So I'm going back to this map because I want to show you that from St. Croix Island in 1604, having survived the rugged winter, the survivors, among whom was Samuel de Champlain, who actually took notes, copious notes, drawings. He mapped out the coastline, and his maps are still in use today. So the survivors of that expedition traveled across the Bay of Fundy, or La Baie Française, or the Gulf of Maine, diagonally to Port Royal in Nova Scotia. Today, it is called Annapolis Royal. Within a very short time, Acadians around the marshlands of the French Bay, or Baie Française, today the Bay of Fundy. Now, this is an arm extending itself from the Atlantic Ocean. So the water is salty. And we'll see how important that is because the French who settled in Acadia devised a system of drying the marshes and therefore creating thousands of acres of arable land. So within 120 years, the French in Acadia managed to create many, many towns and lived very well. So this is kind of a summary of Acadia between 1604 and 1755. In 1610, there were about 100 men who came as, to start building, as many first settlements are, and they intermarried extensively with the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet nations. In 1632, the first families immigrated to the New World, to Acadie, along with 300 craftsmen. Now, this is important because their pattern of immigration is different from other families or other countries. In the case of Acadians, they came as families and extended family members and relatives, and they also came as communities. So it would not be unusual for an entire community, for example, to move together and decide that they were going to settle together in the New World. The first census of Acadie was done in 1671, and 400 people were recorded. In 1701, there were 1,400. In 1711, 2,500. In 1750, 10,000. And 5 years later, 18,500. Now, you might think that it was because the rate of immigration was very strong. That's not necessarily the case. However, the rate of childbirth and was extremely high. And also the colony was separate from contagious diseases. And so people lived a longer life. Also, because they were mostly agriculturalists, they could live very well. And they had gleaned a lot of essential information from the Mi'kmaq, who showed them how to survive in the new climate, showed them the flora that was important in terms of health, but also in terms of medicinal uses. And so it's important to note, I believe, that the Acadians had a friendly relationship with the Mi'kmaq. Not that there weren't any skirmishes, but they did not have to plow with guns in their hands, for example. They had what started out as an active trading partnership transformed into an alliance and a friendship that remained. This is an aerial view of the marshlands. So out in the water, that is the Atlantic Ocean. So this is all salt water flowing over these parts of land. So Acadians had knowledge of a type of drying system that is called Abutua. So this is the Abutua system. So Acadians had to build huge mounds that were higher than the fields they wanted to dry. And they had to be higher than the incoming tides as well. And on the Bay of Fundy, we know that the tides are very high. When the water came in, the water would settle in the marshes, but because of a sluice that was built within the mound of dirt, the water could escape the marshes and slowly filter out of the sluice through a little trap door with a hinge. Now, when the water came up, the door closed so the water from the sea could not come in. And so over 2 or 3 years, the marshlands would dry up, and what remained was extremely fertile, arable land. If you have the opportunity to go to Grand Prix in Nova Scotia, you'll see that the earth is still as black as it was 400 years ago. In fact, in 2012, UNESCO agreed to recognize this system of farming or drying the marshlands as a World Heritage Site, and it is still in use today. Because of that, and you've seen how extensive the Abutua System of diking the marshes can be, it necessitated community, helping neighbors and farmers and family members helping each other, and not only to build the system, but to maintain it and make sure that it was always working so that the agricultural land would not flood. So in the process, this started in the 1630s. So over the years, this process really helped Acadians create an independence for themselves. They were self-sustaining. And of course, demonstrated enormous ingenuity because there were systems similar to this system elsewhere in Europe, but because of the distinct features of the areas where they settled, specifically along the Bay of Fundy, they had to tweak the system. And so over time, the Acadians really developed a distinct identity and of course, created bonds with extended community. And they knew what was known after 1700, Acadia. So this is just to show you the waters, let's say. So the Atlantic Ocean is on the right-hand side. If you look up, you'll see the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the seaway, the Fleuve Saint-Laurent, or the seaway St. Lawrence, that leads to Montreal, Quebec, et cetera, et cetera. It is above the Gaspé Peninsula. So above the St. Lawrence Seaway was New France. Below, and where you see the name Restigouche, is where Acadia was. So there were 2 separate colonies, French colonies in Canada, and they were New France and Acadia. In time, with the development of the diking system, et cetera, the French who call Acadia no longer call themselves French. They call themselves Acadians. This is not a name that was imposed upon them. This is a name that they chose themselves. And although that their ancestors, their homeland was France, they were distinctly different and separate, and they called Acadians. So they prospered quite well. In fact, they even had a number of merchants the Boston and New England areas, whom they supplied all kinds of items. And they were interested, the Acadians were interested in maintaining their lands, maintaining their work, and continuing to prosper as communities and also as families. And since land was readily available to them, they were looking forward to handing down the lands to their family, and so ensuring a legacy where they knew they could live well. In order to do so, however, they maintained a strict policy of neutrality. Between 1630 and 1713, the colony of Acadia changed hand 7 times between England and France, England and France, England and France, and England. And so Acadians were farmers. They were farmers. They were independent-minded, community-spirited, and they wanted to be left alone. There were authorities. It didn't matter to them if the government authorities were British or French. They were not interested in wars. They were interested in living their life, which was a pretty good life and a very, very different life from the one that they had had in France. Over time, the British government felt that, well, this neutrality, it's not secure enough for us. We need an assurance that the Acadians will not turn back. And so they tried to get the Acadians to sign an unconditional oath of surrender, of allegiance. However, most of the oaths that were proposed to them asked them to renounce their Catholic religion, and Acadians flatly refused. And so in 1730, Acadians agreed to sign an oath of conditional allegiance. And the conditions were that Acadians would not be forced to take up arms against the French or against the Mi'kmaq. They also agreed to not take up the arms against the British, and they could maintain their Catholic religion. And so Acadians thought of themselves as completely neutral, not interested in war alone. What was going on in New England at the time was massive immigration from Europe, at least 30 times the rate of immigration to New France, let's say. And New England did not keep up. There weren't enough jobs, there weren't houses. The forests could not be cut down fast enough to build homes, to build roads, to create employment, to create arable land, to feed these people. And so the governors of Nova Scotia and of Massachusetts started thinking that wouldn't it be wonderful if the entire Atlantic coast was British? And so, of course, that meant the colony of Acadia. Wouldn't it be wonderful if instead of these French Catholics, we had good British subjects in their stead? And eventually, the governors of Nova Scotia and Massachusetts, William Shirley and Charles Lawrence, decided to put this great and noble scheme into effect. The Great and Noble Scheme, by the way, is the name of a book by Yale professor, history professor, John MacFaragher. It's an excellent book on the history of Acadians. So on July 20, 1855, Acadians were read this proclamation: "Your lands and tenements, cattle of all sorts, and livestock will be forfeited to the crown, and all of your effects, saving your money and household goods, and you yourselves will be removed from this province." And so Acadians were locked up wherever they had held this meeting. In this instance, in the painting, it is in the church, and the men were therefore imprisoned until ships came to pick them up. So everywhere this happened, the men were separated from the women. The men, that is boys 10 years old and older, were imprisoned with the other men. They did not have any arms save muskets. Those were confiscated. And so they would wait for ships to come in and carry them away. No one knew where they were going. They thought they were going to be, hence the name, the Great Deportation. But they were not to be deported. They were removed from their homes and their homeland, and they were exiled to Protestant colonies to the south, which in time would become US colonies. These colonies did not know Acadians were coming. This was the plan, to separate not the women and men, but to separate families and communities so that there was no risk of the culture being able to recreate itself. This is a drawing from that time in 1758, when the town, after Acadians had been removed and shipped, the town was set ablaze. Homes were burned, livestock killed, crops destroyed, and the lands that Acadians had settled were given to New England planters. So this is a map that shows where Acadians were brought between 1755 and 1757. The deportations, in fact, or the Great Upheaval, as Acadians call it, lasted between 1755 and 1764. So the arrows from at the top in Nova Scotia, the red arrows show where Acadians escaped the deportation and where they went. So you have 2,000 of them going towards Quebec, and then you have 2,000 of them going towards Newfoundland. The blue arrows demonstrate where Acadians were taken from and shipped to. So you have all the New England colonies. You have Virginia. If you notice Virginia, there were 2,400 there, I believe, or maybe 600. They completely refused to allow Acadians to disembark from the ships. The Acadians were forced to wait on the ships until other ships would bring them to prisons in England. And so this is what happened over the first few years. But in reality, the deportations lasted quite a bit longer. Of the 18,500 Acadians in the region, approximately 11,500 were deported or forcibly removed. Half of the Acadians exiled died on ships or from malnutrition or lack of health care. When Acadians landed in these colonies to the south, they were often unwanted. They were not treated as prisoners of war. They were often treated as slaves. They were bound. They were not permitted to walk around in town, although they petitioned. This I find very interesting because they had to have some knowledge of wars and treaties between countries, because they petitioned the governments where they landed, asking them permission to rejoin their families or to search for their families. And in time, after the deportations, let's say, were ended, Acadians petitioned the government of Great Britain to give them permission to return to Acadia. So this is a breakdown of where Acadians were in 1763 on the eve of the Treaty of Paris. So you have Acadians in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, the St. John River, England, Quebec, Baie des Chaleurs, which is on the northeast coast of New Brunswick, Connecticut, Maryland, South Carolina, Nova Scotia, Louisiana, France, Prince Edward Island, for a total of 12,000, I can't see the number, I think it's 12,265. So a great number of Acadians died during these 8 years. And to break a popular myth, Acadians were never deported to Louisiana. They went to Louisiana on their own after the deportations ended. There it is. You can see from Halifax the green arrow that goes to Santo Domingo. So they went to Haiti. However, in Haiti, they did not remain very long because they had no means of sustenance. And 90% of Acadians who went to Santo Domingo or Haiti, in turn, went to Louisiana when they heard that the Catholic Spanish government would give them sustenance for at least a year and would give them lands in the bayous so they could reestablish with their families. And eventually, quite a few Acadians who were in France, having either been released from the prisons in England and sent to France, they made their way to Louisiana. So in a very short time, let's say 20 years, there were tens of thousands of Acadians in Louisiana. So where do the Acadians of northern Maine come into play here? So this is a map of between the St. Lawrence River and the Bay of Fundy. So you have part of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and part of Quebec, and of course, Maine, without the geographic boundaries that we know today. In the, let's say, left-hand corner in the upper side of the map, you'll see an area that is a rectangle. Above that area, you'll see Lake Temiscouata, River du Loup, Kamouraska, Rivière, River Well. These are places that Acadians fled to in trying to escape the deportation. And so Acadians settled there in those areas, and they married French Canadians or Quebecois from those areas. After the Treaty of Paris, Acadians petitioned the government to return to Acadia. And those Acadians who had fled the deportation ended at the bottom of the map at Sands Point. So then, because this group of Acadians decided that this would be their new permanent settlement. And very soon, Acadians coming back from exile and Acadians returning to Acadia met in this place, St. Anne's Point. Today, it is the place of the capital of New Brunswick, Frederick. So we're looking at a period of time between 1763 and 1783. 1783 marks the year that soldiers who'd been loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolution, they flocked to the most available British colony, which was Canada. 40,000 British or English soldiers and their families landed in Canada. 12,000 of them landed at St. Anne's Point. And because Acadians who had developed the lands did not necessarily have ownership of the lands. They were Catholic, they were French, and they were new British subjects. The loyalist soldiers came in and often just walked in the house and said, "You do not own this land. We own the land now. There is no more room for you." At that point, Acadians petitioned the government of New Brunswick and said, "We want land for ourselves." There were three reasons. First, the influx of English Protestants made it highly unlikely that Acadians would ever get the service of a French Catholic priest. The closest diocese, if you will, was in Quebec City, which was quite a ways away. And so it seemed unlikely that their religion could flourish. Also, because there were such a great number of loyalists, of newcomers, let's say, it was very evident that forests would have to be cut down to make room for villages, to make housing, to create arable land, which would in effect, first of all, deplete their resources, the resources they had been counting on, that they bartered with or sold to either individuals or businesses. And so it became economically unfeasible for them to stay there. And there was no point, there was no way that they could leave a legacy for their children or grandchildren. If they could not own their land and pursue a healthy livelihood, then they had nothing more to gain from living there. And so they petitioned the government for land in what was called Madawaska territory. So where you see the rectangle up north towards the left-hand side is where the Madawaska River and the St. John River meet. That is in the Madawaska territory. So that area was well known because if you look at the waterways, you see that the Bay of Fundy, the St. John River goes clear across the entire length of the province of New Brunswick, then meets the Madawaska River up to Témiscouata Lake. And then there's a small portage, and then you're in Quebec. You're at the St. Lawrence River, where you can have easy access to the cities of Quebec and Montreal. That was the communications highway that had been identified since the early 1600s. It was the mail route between Halifax and Montreal. So it was a very well-known area, but it had not been inhabited by Europeans. There were 60 Maliseet families living in the area, and Acadians knew this, and they petitioned the New Brunswick government to settle there. And in 1785, the first 16 families settled in the territory of Madawaska. This is a close-up of that rectangle. And you see the St. John River flows in the middle of the map. And on either side are, to the south, are northern Maine. To the north is New Brunswick, Canada. So when Acadians arrived, they settled very close to the, I don't know if you can see my cursor, I don't think so, where there's the junction of the Madawaska River and the St. John River. To the right of that is where the Maliseet village was. So Acadians settled very close to the Maliseets. There again, underlining the history of friendship between the two people. They settled on both sides of the St. John River. Sometimes a son would settle across from the father. Two brothers would settle across from each other, or a person would settle and the land that was given crossed the river. And so it was miles long and stretched on both sides of the river. This is a map of the first concession by the British government. It shows the St. John River, and to the far left, you see the Indian Reserve, and you see the Madawaska River joining where it joins the St. John River. So all the lands to the right of the Madawaska River were given to Acadian families. This is a map of 1790. And so you have, within a very short time, you have extended family and extended community coming to this area. They had access to the river. They had great lengths of land, and they were divided up in spaghetti lots, which gave each settler access to the river, an area to make their farm and or have a plant. And then they had access to the woods, so they could have timber. So in a very short, within 15 years, there were 2,000 people living in this, the Madawaska territory, as it was still called then. Then the next thing to arrive was the border conflict. So the Acadians settled in 1785, and within a very short time, 1800, there were over 2,000 people, and it was a very homogeneous population. Whether they were French Canadians from Quebec or Acadians from Acadia, they both had the same ancestors. They were both from France. They shared a language, they shared a religion, they shared traditions, customs, foods. They were similar in so many aspects that we can consider this population was almost 100% French and Catholic. And so they lived very well, peacefully, on either side of the St. John River. In 1820, Maine separated from Massachusetts and became its own state. However, the boundaries were defined in at the south and the east and west, but not the north. It was very nebulous. And the reason for that was because the treaty that had been written in 1783 described the boundary as the highlands. And so there was no precise description of what the highlands could be. But as you can see on this map, the US claimed that the highlands in the red line were in fact in the Témiscouata area of Quebec. Great Britain felt that the highlands were Marceau in Maine. And eventually, after 22 years, a commission of the Lords Webster and Ashburton decided that the border was where it actually is today, the blue line. And so, although it was not a military campaign that was fought by either side, and there were no casualties, there were no skirmishes, there was enormous tension that built up during the course of 1820 to 1842 and caused the creation of forts. The first fort you see in the upper left-hand corner is the fort in Fort Kent. And that is the original fort constructed in 1839. It is the only original fort still standing. On the top right-hand corner, you see a reproduction of a British fort, and that is in Edmundston, New Brunswick, on the other side of the river, across from Madawaska, Maine. On the bottom left-hand corner is the palisade and blockade in Cabano, Quebec, on the Témiscouata Lake. And it is beautiful. In the summer, they have reenactments, and you can visit the entire village, and there are museums and artifacts. Really quite a wonderful site. On the bottom right-hand corner is the reproduction or restoration of the fort in Fort Fairfield. So here you see, I chose this map because you can easily see where the New France colony would have been and the Acadian colony would have been. So everything in, well, of course, Nova Scotia and the southern part of New Brunswick was Acadia. And in the upper is where the Gaspé Peninsula, and on the other side, Quebec, that was New France. So because we're going to be talking about Franco-Americans, I'd just like to give a few pointers of the differences between those two colonies. Because as I said, although they did share the same homeland and in many cases the same ancestors, they had a completely different evolution from the beginning of their settlements or specific colonies throughout. So in Acadie, the first settlement was in 1604, and New France was 1608. Both New France and Acadia were founded by Samuel de Champlain. In Acadie, immigration was by families and communities. In New France, it was individual men. And during a period of 40 years, because there were only men in the colony of New France, France sent 800, they were called les filles à marier, or les filles du roi, or the king's daughters. They had been trained or formed to settle this new land with men who already were in Quebec. And so they set off on it was both an adventure and a mission to raise children in this new world and help their new husbands. In Acadie, Acadians and Mi'kmaq shared families, and Acadians settled not in the forests, but they settled along the waterways of the Atlantic Ocean. In Quebec, the settlers had to cut the forests, and so there were often skirmishes with the Iroquois or the Hurons. There were many military groups in Quebec, les Carignan de Salière, for example. There were 800 soldiers who had been sent to fight the Native Americans, and many of them stayed. So throughout the colony, New France was in fact governed by France. Acadie, as I mentioned before, changed hand 7 times. So this is where the 2 colonies of France merged, and so the descendants of these 2 people between 1830 and 1930, or 1840 and 1930, approximately 1 million French Canadians immigrated to New England and to the United States. You can see some of the states here, and I'll show you another map in a few seconds. So they immigrated to New England, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And they were either from Quebec, the province of Quebec, or from Acadia. Oops, how did I do that? Sorry. Trying to find my cursor, excuse me. Oops. Okay, so this is another map that shows, to the right-hand side, you have the French colonies of Quebec and Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and in Nova Scotia. So those are depicted in blue, and you can see where the French migrated. They migrated throughout New England, but also towards the Western states and to Louisiana. So I'm not going to go into what brought them to Maine. Basically, it was an opportunity to have a better life and to benefit from a life working in new industries. They had been invited to come. There were Maine and New England were entering the industrialization era, and they did not have enough workforce. And so they were invited to come. This map shows the Kennebec-Chaudière connection. So basically from Quebec, going through Jackman, the Fort, etc., right down to Portland. So there were many French Canadians or Acadians who went to these areas because the lumber, the forest industry starting in the 1830s, and they remain because They settled with their families, and they did not want to return. Often at the onset of immigrations, the French Canadians wanted to return to Quebec. They thought that they would make some money and then return to Quebec, but most of them stayed. They did encounter much prejudice and anti-Catholic sentiments. This is a depiction of the Catholic Church in Bath being burned in 1858. The number of French Canadians who immigrated to Maine was upsetting for the English Protestants because they saw that their sheer numbers could upset the authority, either in the government, that is in politics, or in the industry. Let's say these French Catholics decided that they wanted a union, or they decided to strike because of poor working conditions. So it was not necessarily, they were not well seen. Not that they, the authorities had cause, but they were seen as a menace. And they were seen as a menace also because they held on to their traditions, they held on to their Catholic religion, and they very much were attached to their villages, their little Canadas, their parishes, etc., and they kept their traditions alive. And they were numerous enough that these events, for example, if festivals celebrated St. John the Baptist, then they would surely have been noticed.
Lise, I hate to interrupt, but it is actually 8 o'clock. So if you could start to
okay,
speed up. It's fascinating stuff.
Yes.
But we do promise people to end a date. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I apologize. So in fact, the sheer number of French Catholics was upsetting, and it brought about a resurgence of the KKK in Maine, which is not necessarily a well-known fact. In 1919, an anti-French law was adopted by the state of Maine, and it made it illegal to use French as a language of transmitting education. And so there was a great deal of ridicule, corporal punishment, shaming, and discrimination that went along with this law. In the St. John Valley, language remained French. So these are advertisements that were published in the 1900s, completely in French. So how was that possible? It was possible because of the interactions, the daily interactions between the two sides of the St. John River. And those allowed the Acadians of northern Maine to keep their language, their customs, their religions, etc., etc. Today, there is hardly any French program in the elementary schools. And of course, since 9/11, and especially since 9/11 and COVID, the daily interactions are almost impossible. So for us, for me and others like me, we want to see a return to these interactions to foster and nurture the elements of identity that have made us who we are and continue to be. So I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much, Lise. I learned an enormous amount. If you could unshare your screen, so to speak,
yes,
so that everybody can see everybody. And while you're doing that, let me just say, We're a little over time. We totally understand if you need to leave, but I think, Lise, are you willing to stay on for a few more minutes if anyone would like to stay and ask questions? Okay. So if you would like to stay and ask questions, either type them into the chat or put your hand up on your screen. I'm going to put my screen so I can see most of the faces, and I will watch for hands and see. Many of you have taken your video off, so if you've got your video off, I won't see your hand, just so you know. Or you could type Tim, I don't know how to pronounce it, Cyr? Tim
Cyr, bien sûr.
Alors,
c'est un nom acadien.
Alors, moi je suis anglaise, mais alors, it would be good if you could ask your question in English, please.
Bien sûr. Lise, you mentioned a book on the history of l'Acadie from a Yale professor. Could you, what's the name of that book?
The name is A Great and Noble Scheme.
A Great and Noble Scheme.
By John Mac Farrager.
Oh, God. Spell that one.
And I will send that information.
Okay, that'd be great.
In an email.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
And Tim, you can always contact the library, and we can send the information on to you. Or
Excellent.
if you Google A Great and Noble Scheme, you'll probably find it.
I'll find it. I'm pretty good at this stuff. Thanks.
I'm watching for hands here. Okay, right now I'm not seeing hands. You can also speak up in case I haven't seen you.
Lise Pelletier.
Okay, go for it.
You're muted.
Who is trying to say something?
Annette.
Annette. Yeah. Okay, Annette, do you have a question?
No. Okay.
I have a comment. Thank you so very much. It was wonderful. And my grandparents came down from Mont-Laurier, Quebec, and settled in Massachusetts in a small French-speaking village. And I had the fortune of going to 8 years of French school with the nuns. And it was wonderful. Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
Merci.
There's a question there's a question in the chat. Oh, sorry, there's a hand. Robert Pelletier. I don't know if you're related, Robert.
Born, brought up in St. John Plantation, which is about 7 miles upriver from Fort Kent.
Yes.
My dad's name was Fred Z. Pelletier. He was a potato farmer, like many of the farmers up there were. In addition to Tim's comment about books, there's an excellent book called The Land Between the Rivers, meaning the St. Lawrence and the St. John River. And there was to be a sequel to that book, and I forget the author's name now, but I've been looking for that for about 10 years now.
Yes, it's called The Land in Between.
Yeah, The Land in Between.
By Beatrice Craig.
Okay.
Beatrice, what was the last
Craig.
Okay.
Now there's a question.
One comment.
Oh yes, go on. I'm so sorry,
please?
Robert. I thought you'd finished. Go ahead.
One comment. Was Louisbourg ever a factor in the immigration of Acadians? It was a very important trading post in Nova Scotia, but that wasn't mentioned tonight.
No.
What's the story behind that one?
Yes, that's that's like opening up a completely not necessarily different parentheses because there are links from Louisbourg, the Violet family.
Yeah.
It came directly from France to Louisbourg. And there were some Acadians who fled the deportations by going to Louisbourg. They were eventually deported. Louisbourg was destroyed as a port. Yeah.
There was also, we were up in Quebec City a month ago, and we visited the Isle of Orleans, where Jean Pelletier, all the Pelletier's predecessor, landed back in 1640 or something. And the French heritage is one that's not to be forgotten. It's very interesting, especially the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. So, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.
I think you need to have a Pelletier reunion party. Now, there's a question in the chat, which I do want to get to.
We did in Madawaska.
She's got a question.
The question in the chat is from the Boros family, and it said, could you please say something about Longfellow's poem Evangeline?
Well, that would be an entirely different presentation.
Oh, it's fiction.
Well, that's presumably
repeat.
what lies behind the question. Okay.
Actually, I have taught that poem. I have taught Acadian literature, and I have curated exhibits about Evangeline in conjunction with the history of Acadians. Evangeline, and you have to understand the context in which this poem was created and the effect it produced in Acadia. So it was published in 1847 at a time when Acadians were just starting to re-emerge from ethnic cleansing, from going home, from re-establishing themselves. They were now British subjects. They, for a long time, could not vote. They were outnumbered. They were French. They were Catholics. It was not necessarily a good place to be in terms of a minority population. And the poem came and exploded the silence that had gone on silently and was never talked about. And so Acadians used the poem to talk about the real facts of history. Evangeline elicits different responses from different people in Louisiana. Many say she stole Cajun's history because her persona took up so much space that she replaced real history.
Okay, am I allowed to ask a question? So I wondered if you, I'm obviously, you can tell by my accent, I'm a newcomer to Maine. So at its peak, do we have any idea what percentage of Mainers were Francophone? And when would that peak have been, the largest number of French speakers?
Oh, there are numbers. Oh my gosh. There are numbers. In fact, there are numbers that relate to the towns where French Canadians landed. It's very interesting as well that I find that these immigrants were known as French Canadians when they immigrated. Within one generation, they were no longer French Canadians. They were Americans, or Franco-Americans. Their children were 100% Americans. And yet we still call them French Canadians, you know, other. There are demographic data about towns such as Lewiston, Waterville, Augusta, in Massachusetts and Woonsocket, Rhode Island. The numbers are there. Today, there are approximately 14 million descendants of French Canadians in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the majority of those are no longer speaking French at home. Any variety of French at home.
That is true. Although in Maine, I think I'm not sure what the percentage is right now. I couldn't tell you.
Okay, I was just curious. Well, I probably should be trying to wind this up and give Lise a break, but we could do one more question if there's any hands in the air. Let me just look at this. Okay, yeah. Joe, the first one I saw was Joe Ferrigno.
Yes, I have a question. I've been trying to find information about an Acadian woman named Roseanne Michaud who lived in Fort Kent. She became a neighbor of mine. She was a mother of Maine, I think in the 60s, and she died in 1975. I have an article about her that I could send to you if I have your email. She was a textile person that I became friends with, and
well, Joe, I can give you Lisa's email, Lise, if that's all right with you. Okay.
Okay, and I'll send it on to you.
Thank you.
If you find anything about her, I would be interested to know. I don't know her maiden name. I only know her married name, which was Michaud.
Okay.
Okay, so it behooves me to tie up the loose ends here. So first of all, a big thanks to you, Lise. Thank you very much. It was just wonderful. We learned.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it tremendously.
And I just want to tell everyone that the next speaker in our speaker series is on the 18th of November at 7 o'clock. It's Nikki Sakara. She's the co-founder of Community Water Justice, and she'll be speaking about Maine's water sovereignty in a global water crisis. So complete change of subject, but another crucially important subject to those of us here in Maine. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. And thank you again, Lise.
Thank you.